Excellent. So this talk, I never learned how to pronounce the last part of your name, Baron
Dipitous,
Dipitous?
yeah, it is.
Dipitous.
Yeah, it's based on the word serendipitous.
Ah, okay. So Baron Dipitous is going to talk to us about looking at the languages that have been proposed for Zelda. So you can take it away.
Thank you. So it is very exciting to me to be involved in this in this conference. This is the first time I've become involved in this Conlang conference, and um, I have run into the trap of having a lot of information but not enough time to share it. So, but I am happy to talk about some of the main points of what I have gone into with this topic. So, first of all, a bit about this is a bit about myself. I kind of so yeah, Baron Dipitous is a moniker that I use for my creative projects, especially my conlangs. I am a librarian by profession, and uh, yeah, but who likes games and everything. I did make a couple of conlangs for and I've been using them in an indie production studio called Banner Media. So almost home, you can actually get. There's a bunch of things of my Teketid language. The first one I wrote back when I was interested in got into conlanging with a college class that I took. Um, and I know Legend of Zelda and video games might not be might be a bit different from what is often talked about in here. But first of all, it's something I've been thinking about, talking about somewhere on the internet for a while. Second of all, a few weeks ago, the series itself celebrated 35 years, so really good timing there. Um, anyway, so my main research question was to look at the linguistic history of the peoples of Hyrule, basically, in the various Legend of Zelda games. I wanted to look at them essentially like as it is and kind of assuming that it's all part of a cohesive like timeline and everything like that. There are a few disclaimers to this, which I'll briefly go over, but yeah, I'm certainly not the first or the last to look into the linguistics of Zelda, but usually when I have been looking at different articles and studies into this kind of thing, they usually focus on just one thing. And it was my hope to kind of like go over, like give a general overview and kind of like collect the data that I've looked at and that other people have looked at for a more broader view of the series as a whole, linguistically. I had two main focuses, points of focus for this. First of all, there was how the common language, which is called Hylian, is developed over time through the games and the canon timeline of it. And also, the most recent Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, probably has the most amount of linguistic data of any other Zelda game ever. And so I wanted to look specifically at some things in there as well. These are some of the disclaimers. Basically, the publisher of the series, Nintendo, it's very clear they kind of go one game at a time. They usually don't have like an overarching goal or story for the entire series. It's just kind of like, okay, we're going to make a game about this. And then later on, they say, how would it fit into what we've already done, essentially. But I am going to be operating as much as possible under the assumption that this is like this is a cohesive like narrative and timeline and everything. But yeah, and I'm of course focusing on the English version of each game. I think there's a lot of research that could be done in the other language versions of these. A basic outline of what I'm going over pretty quickly. I did do a brief literature review with a bunch of links on examples of like translation and of like studies into this kind of thing, whether it be specifically a specific race in Breath of the Wild or looking at the writing systems and such, and fan-made conlangs inspired by the Legend of Zelda series. So most of these are for the common language of the series, Hylian, but one person did do the desert warrior race in an earlier game as well. So anyway, this is what the sort of like this is what all the games look like organized in a timeline. Not necessarily the game release order, but the events in the games in chronology. You see the timeline actually, oddly enough, splits three ways, whether the hero is defeated by, by evil, or whether he's triumphant. And then there's weird time stuff that happens in Ocarina of Time that splits it further into two, which which causes some interesting things to happen linguistically, especially, as I'll point out later. This yellow box I added down here, this is Breath of the Wild. It is not clear where in the timeline it is, except it's just much, much later. And there's clues from all 3 timelines in Breath of the Wild. So I just kind of have it down there. And then there's a note down there that talks about how, sometimes a couple of games get switched around a little bit. Like there's a little bit of switching going on here from an earlier version of this chart. But this is essentially what it all looks like. So people have looked in the past at all of the different Hylian scripts and alphabets and syllabaries and organized them in different ways, according to in different like fan-made wiki sites. Whether they organized them or labeled them chronologically or just labeled them based on like when we see them in the actual games themselves. And so the labeling of these different like scripts and syllabaries are not really consistent. It's just sort of like it's in the fandom has kind of been, choose how you want to label them. I'm choosing, just for simplicity's sake, to kind of call them by like first Hylian script, second script, third script, which is the order of game release. So instead of the first script being from the earliest in the timeline, the first script is the earliest video game that was released in the series. But there are, I'll show the other names for it as well. So the first examples, like in the earliest Zelda games, are just very simple ones, just kind of like hints at the fact there are the linguistic culture there. Ancient Hylian, which is really just 3 symbols, or you need a book to translate and things like that. Then we get into syllabaries, which actually translate into real Japanese. Sort of like as Easter eggs for fans, but like in the world, this is what you see this kind of thing on signs and so forth. And then you see kind of a more developed syllabary in later iterations of the Zelda franchise as well. On sign, this is the full syllabary down there in the left. What's odd is that Twilight Princess, which is a game that comes later with the 4th script, also has examples of the 3rd script in it, specifically in tombstones in the cemetery, which is an interesting little incongruency. But 4th Hylian script we actually get into alphabets now. You see this alphabet in sort of like this in like magical artifacts and things like that. You also see it see another version of this alphabet where even in the very first game of the series, you see kind of in a pedestal there. And then in the most recent games that have been made, that same alphabet from before has been sort of modified a bit, as you can see there. And so this is the chart of what all of those look like. I'm basically keeping that numbering system. And you can see how muddled it is, but there are a couple of interesting things that could come from kind of looking at that. For example, even though like someone calls number 2 old syllabary and number 3 new syllabary, even though that is clearly should be switched around. It is interesting that if we look at if we take what we know and put it on this timeline, we see that the Hylian language started with alphabets, but then they started using syllabaries. And then as the timeline branched off, we see different approaches as well, whether it be the logographic going into a different alphabet, an alternate alphabet from the ancient one, or continuing the syllabary until we get back into another alphabet and then a syllabary again, or simply sticking with an sort of like ancient syllabary from before. So it's kind of, and it's interesting. There's of course a lot of like nitty-gritty details within all of this. For example, in this section in the Wind Waker game, this syllabary is actually seen as an ancient language, which makes sense from the fact that it shows up back here as well. So there are a lot of like a lot of very confusing things. And they also, the writing system seemed to switch between like ancient and magic groups and the common language as well. I wish I had more space to show that, but I always thought it was interesting. There are specific morphemes that are unique to this setting as well. And this is just like an example. They usually have to do with items or enemies or monsters that have to be fought or used or whatever. But it's kind of cool. For example, if you see something that says Stal something, you know it's a skeleton something. If you see Fos at the end of something, they could, that it's an anthropomorphic, lizard or anthropomorphic wolf creature or something. Boko and Deku are interesting because they kind of been used interchangeably throughout different games, and it's not clear which one came earlier in the timeline, but I thought that was kind of neat. So, and there are other examples of non-Hylian languages as well. There's an alphabet for the desert-dwelling Gerudo people. There's a case where these tiny Minish people, and you have to eat a nut in order to learn and speak the language. There's some skywriting for an ancient sky-dwelling race. And here's most interesting, and I wish there was more about this. In one game, Majora's Mask, there is a script for the fish people, Zora, and you cannot read it unless you are a Zora yourself. And there's a mask that turns you physically into a different species. And similar thing with like the rock people and Goron. There's nothing else. There's no other justification for why that is. It's just sort of like a lock with a key in a game, basically. You have to be a Zora to read the script, and that's it. But that's a rather interesting little thing. And now I'm going to briefly go over the languages of the wild, the races and the species in the Breath of the Wild. I essentially approach this like field research in a video game, which I think is kind of a neat concept in and of itself. And this is where, like I mentioned, that Breath of the Wild has so much more linguistic data than any other individual game. And this is why. First, some general observations. So I looked at all of the names of each person in each species and as many place names as I could and any other linguistic data I could as well. There do seem to be certain linguistic properties to kind of like, enhance the like flavor or culture of each species. But those features seem more prominent for characters and places with more significance in the game's story itself. So it's not entirely consistent within the world. For example, every single civilization, regardless of where they are, what their culture is, has at least one name that ends in sun somewhere. The desert tribe has a Ronson. The fish people tribe has another one that ends in sun, that kind of thing. Also, the civilization with the most distinctive like linguistic like nomenclature tend to be furthest away from the contemporary, such as ancient monks, and the humanoid, such as the small sprite-like Koroks, which you'll see in a moment. And then place names sometimes follow observed local conventions, but just as often do not, because it's not clear in the game who named all of the places. But I think I think just sort of all of this sort of ambiguity of the linguistic nomenclature is a testament to the blending of like, basically, these are not isolated communities. Well, they kind of are because it's a wild, untamed area, but there are roads between all of them. So you see some of the bird-like Rito coming to visit the desert-like Gerudo, who come to visit the rock-like Gorons, for example. And I think that can certainly explain in the world why there's so much sort of like linguistic ambiguity. First of all, the Gerudo. One thing that excited me and a lot of other Zelda linguist fans is the fact that they actually had spoken dialogue in their own specific Gerudo language. And these are the examples of that. You can actually hear it when you speak to non-player characters. And also the Gerudo alphabet returns on monuments and so forth. And you see a lot of, and if you translate them into English, you see a lot of references to Gerudo being brilliant, vigilant, desert flower, desert sun that doesn't fade, and that kind of thing. Really, really neat insights when you look into that. And you can see the examples of what I saw with the names and with the place names and such as well. This is the rock-like Goron. Here you see kind of more hard consonants like Daruk and Vulcan, but you also get things like pile and tray and heel and things like that. They also have a few unique words. You have like Goro, which I think they kind of say Goro and brother interchangeably, like, how are you doing, Goro? Or let's climb this mountain, brother, and that sort of thing. Kind of like punctuating the end of statements, which is similar to something in like in Final Fantasy. That's how different. That's just like, small connection I made, but Final Fantasy doesn't have anything to do with Zelda, as far as I know. Someone mentions Goron's shoulder, which I don't know how real it is in the world. I don't know if they might be bluffing. They also have something called rock roast, which is rock that looks like steak, which I think is kind of funny. And so, and that sort of thing. Hylians are kind of like the standard humans, I guess, if you want to call them. They're the most common, and there doesn't seem to really be any like distinctive linguistic properties to them, except that they're, for lack of a better term, compared to the rest of the world, normal. Although there might be some unique royal names here. With you see King Rome Bosphoramus Hyrule, where his last name is the name of the country. So there's that. The Koroks are these forest sprites. They often have like these little cute 1 and 2 syllable names. But you also get things like Walton, which is a bit odd next to Zuki and Hetsu and Maka. I didn't see any place names. There's not a whole lot. There's sort of like these mysterious, mischievous like creatures everywhere. We have the bird like Rito, sorry. There's a lot of like Ali or Ellie or things like that in their names, but that's probably the only like distinct thing I could find. There are previous games in the timeline have like drawn connection between these bird race and the fish people, the Zora, but that's not in Breath of the Wild specifically. They're actually quite different. Then you have an interesting case where you have ancient technology that's more advanced than contemporary technology. And this is where we have more consistent, linguistic properties among these different monks, like these ancient monks that have names like Oman Ao, Akvakot, and things like that, with their own language that is kind of decorates. So a lot of interesting, like sort of hints and designs in their technology and in the way their names are that hint at how advanced and how rich this ancient culture was. Compared to the contemporary Sheikah in this world, they are a lot more traditional. They're essentially like Hylian, but with a specific, they dress in a certain way, their houses in their village looks a certain way. And there are like different factions as well. They don't seem to have any clear linguistic properties. They seem very similar to like Hylians, except for their heritage. And here we have the Zora, the fish people. I didn't find a lot of specific linguistic things about them, except I did see O and U a lot more. Muzu, Ruto, Ruta, that sort of thing. And you kind of see it in some of their names, place names as well. Ruto, Precipice, Toto, Lake, and such. But that was all I was able to find. And so just in general, I thought this would be just a fun exercise, in kind of doing field and historical research in a fictional world and timeline that I personally like. But I also thought, this can certainly be a very interesting exercise to see, like, especially for fictional franchises where this like conlangs and like linguistic cultures tend to be a bit secondary as well. And you can kind of look at all these different clues, and maybe just looking at each of these various races you saw, there might have been ideas that came to your head about maybe a couple extra like linguistic things that you or other people could add to kind of fill out the gaps that are given, essentially. So, but yeah, I of course focused on like my own research as well as other like fan research to help put this together. And I also see opportunities for future research as well, not just in Zelda, but also just in, this is mostly like in Zelda. There is a sequel to Breath of the Wild coming, and there's hints of language being used in different ways. I think someone deciphered some of this Gerudo script, this magic ritual kind of weirdness coming out here. So yeah, that's all I had. I was going very fast through that, but I had a lot more information than I had time for. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I think everyone on the YouTube stream was really engaged. We have a lot of Zelda buffs there. Maybe you want to end your screen share there.
Oh, right. Yeah. There we go.
I'll ask a question from YouTube first, and I think it was earlier on when you were talking about perhaps the incongruous nature of what was old versus new language.
Right. Yeah.
Walker Scott wanted you to expand on how is an old script showing up on tombstones incongruous?
Oh, okay. Right. So when I was saying old and new, I was specifically talking about the syllabaries because one of the wiki sites I was on labeled them as such. I guess I probably didn't make it very clear, but there were cases where what one site called an old syllabary showed up earlier in the timeline. Well, the new syllabary showed up earlier in the timeline than the old syllabary did, and that's what I'm talking about. I guess I did use the word incongruous when talking about the tombstones, and I think it was more that it seemed odd to me at first, but looking at it again, and I mean, I think it's mostly that there's no other examples of it anywhere else. Like even in other like Hylian or humanoid settlements, that specific script doesn't show up elsewhere. So maybe incongruous is not the right word, especially when looking at it a bit more. It's more like that's an interesting tidbit that seems odd at first, but that could give a kind of a clue into how that syllabary was used in the past for those people between the games.
And one of our upcoming presenters, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name yet. Is it Ronnie or Ronit? Had a question if they want to. There we go.
Yeah, it's Ronit. And yeah, hi, great presentation. I just wanted to ask, I know you mentioned that there are many different, types of, I guess, can you call them people in Zelda? But right. I was wondering how, if they all use like different languages, if there's any like intercommunication between that, or if it's like special in any way.
Yeah. So it's actually not. So speaking for Breath of the Wild specifically, the most recent game, it's not 100% clear where all of them have their own language. It is clear that they all can speak the common Hylian language with each other. It just seemed interesting. And certainly the Gerudo, the desert people, certainly have their own script and their own language with the unique words of like, Savota, Savak, and that kind of thing. But as for all the other ones, the bird like Rito, the fish like Zora, and so forth, they all seem to be very much fluent and comfortable with the common tongue of Hylian. But it's interesting to me that they each seem to have at least one or two unique linguistic properties in the naming, anyway.
Okay, thank you.
We're quickly running out of time, but I think an important shout out that I saw in the YouTube comments. Are you familiar with the work of, I don't know this person in real life, only from Twitter, N. Christine Johnson?
Yeah, isn't that the person who did the Vayahanev or something? Or am I thinking of something?
I think she's been expanding at least some of the language. I'm not a big Zelda person, so I don't. Sure. I'm not in the lore.
Yeah, Nina Christine Johnson. Yeah, I saw she was in my literature review. Yeah, she developed her own fan-made version of the Gerudo dwelling, the desert dwelling Gerudo people, their language. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I would definitely encourage you to pop over to the YouTube comments at some point and take a look there. A lot of people are big Zelda buffs, and there were some interesting comments about what happened when some of these words or languages got adapted for I believe it was the French version of the game.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Could be fun to talk about that over there.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.